Welcome to this talk. Little information, this talk is a repetition of the mini talk that I gave this morning. It was super packed down in the expo area, so they thought of creating a new space in the schedule just to repeat it for the ones who maybe couldn't attend. So if you've seen it, it's going to be the same stuff. My name is Ciro Continisio, and I want to introduce you to the new prefab workflows, which are going to debut in Unity 2018.3. So this is the image of the prefab that we all know and love. But I want to propose a reflection to you. Like, prefabs have changed the way they behave in the editor with the new workflows. Before, we were used to see prefabs as something that was in the project folder, that was an asset. We will drag it to the hierarchy or the scene, and then we will see this thing. So we will see it, for example, in the hierarchy as a structure. It could have some child objects. And then we could potentially insert another prefab inside it. But then as soon as we hit apply, we lose that prefab, right? So there was no nesting. And also we had this apply-based workflow. This is prefabs up until now, up until 2018.2. So I want to introduce you to a new workflow. And to do that, I want to jump to the editor. And I have a little scene full of assets taken from the asset store from a very talented creator called Beffio. This is Farm Life. And I assembled this little scene just to show you how to use prefabs, and I made a few use cases for them. So I want to start from this well. Well, first thing you will notice in the new workflow is that we have icons in the hierarchy now. The white box means game object. The blue box means that it's a prefab. The box that has two diverging lines is a variant. There is actually no icon, no special icon for nested prefabs because nested prefabs don't exist, in the sense that when a prefab is put inside another prefab, it's nested, but it doesn't mean that that's a specific type. That's not a special type. So there's no icon for it. But the icons are fundamental because with the additional complexity that this workflow enables, in your workflows, you really need to have a clear vision. So much of the research from the team didn't just go into the technical solution to enable this, but also in the UX. And they had to make some cuts. They could add some things, always with some principles in mind. And one of them is safety. So they wanted you not to make mistakes when you edit your prefabs. And I'll show you a few things that have been done in this regard. This well is a game object. It's pretty nice. I'm going to turn into a prefab the same usual way. So I just select any folder. I'm going to select one called Prefabs, and I'm going to drag the well into the folder. And the well game object sorry, just becomes a prefab. The icon turns blue. We see the asset down here. And now to edit this prefab, sure, we could make changes here in the hierarchy/scene, but I would really discourage it. That's what we're doing. We're saying, don't do it this way. That's the old way. You can still do it, but there's another way to do it now. So how would you do it? You will enter what is called prefab mode. And prefab mode is reachable from three different positions. One is this little arrow that you see here in the hierarchy. The other one is by double-clicking on the prefab asset. And the third one is by clicking on this button that you see here in the inspector when you select the asset. Any of the three will bring you here. And prefab mode, as you can see, takes control of the scene view and displays your prefab in isolation. In isolation in the scene and in isolation in the hierarchy. So you have full visibility over whatever change you're making, how the change is affecting at least the appearance of the prefab, right? And also the hierarchy is not cluttered with other objects. So for instance, if I wanted to edit this prefab here, I could just literally scale it, and I will see the change automatically apply here. Why do I see it automatically apply? I'm going to undo. Because, and I made a mistake, because this is not apply. This is called now saving. Because as I said before prefabs were something in the scene. So we were making some changes on an instance, and we were applying them to the original prefab. Now, what we're doing is we are opening the actual asset. So we're inside there. We're already inside the prefab. We don't need to apply to any source content. We just save. And save has been made automatic because we believe that many people know what they're doing. So they want a faster workflow. They just want to make some changes. They don't want to hit the apply button like 100 times. So you can have autosave. You can uncheck it if you want. Maybe you're experimenting, or the prefab is so big that you just want to make a lot of changes, and then you save every now and then. And what was I going to say? Yeah, and changes, by the way, are also undoable, as I did now, right? So contrary to what was before with apply. So I can do this, and I can do this. So you see the autosave now makes much more sense. I'm in this safe environment. I make my changes, and I see what they do in the scene as well. It's really, really powerful, but at the same time, it gives you a lot of control and visibility over what you're doing. I want you to note one thing, though. Who noticed what's the icon of the object in the hierarchy? Who noticed that it's a game object and not a prefab? So in this new workflow, the root object of a prefab is actually a game object. And that's why I want to go back to the presentation to introduce my first metaphor. And I really want to push you to think of prefabs as boxes, not as a reference to, not as an asset that you just drag into the scene, but like a box. A box that can contain game objects, other prefabs, variants, these things. So if this is the game object with its values, the prefab is really just a wrapping. And the wrapping comes on top, and it still shows the values inside. We're still able to change the values from the outside, and we can also change them from the inside. And that's what we need to do, right? When we edit in prefab mode, we basically open this box, change the value, and then we exit prefab mode, and we go back to the scene, and we see the change has happened. Next one. Sorry, I have steps. So once you understand that, once you see prefab as boxes, you can think that you can put anything in there, right? So if this is my box, I can take this bucket, I'm gonna copy it, and then I wanna delete it. And then I go inside the well, and I paste it. And there you go. And now the bucket game object is part of the prefab. As you can see, it retains the game object icon, as you would expect. Everything is in order. And again, once you do this, why not nest a prefab? It's easy, right? So we go to the content, and I grab a little rock from the prefabs, and I just drop it in here. And now I have a nested prefab. But this is not a nested prefab, this is just a prefab that has been nested in this particular prefab, right, in this box. And then I close the box, and I see them from the outside. So for instance, I could do something like this. I could bring the rock into the scene again, and maybe bring it into view. There you are. Come here. And once I make changes to this rock, you will see that the changes will be applied to this rock here. So where do I make my changes? Do I want to make them here? Do I want to make them here? No, I want to go inside the box. So I open the rock, I take it, I make my changes, and immediately the changes are propagated. I go back, and I find that they're being propagated to this and to this, right? As you would expect nested prefab to work. But again, you know, you have to thank the team, not me. But you have to know, but again, you know what you're doing, right? You know very well what you're doing. And you can potentially go inside this prefab and undo the change if you remember the values or something. Or revert this asset if you have a CVS, version control system. So you revert just the rock, and all of the instances of the rock will revert in every prefab, even if they're nested in any place. And I said, I want to open the box, right? Sorry, I forgot one thing. If you think of prefabs as boxes, then it also makes sense to remove this box, right? I put the box on, I can remove it. And before we had something called break prefab instance. It was, you know, in the case when you lost your prefab or you wanted to like detach a game object, it was useful. But now we have something called unpack prefab. And unpack prefab in this scenario, it really looks like you're unpacking. So if I unpack this prefab, what do I get? If I unpack the rock, I get a game object. I get the original game object that I used to create the prefab. And if I unpack the well, what do I get? Let's see. I get the contents. I get the game object, the bucket game object, and the rock prefab that I used. It's all very linear. If I undo the unpacking and I jump into the well, this is the contents that I was seeing, right? So it makes sense that when I unpack, I see this. And lastly, unpack prefab completely means that Unity is going to remove all the boxes. So whatever prefab is nested, whatever variant, they're all going to be unpacked, contents are taken out, box is thrown away, and prefab is put there in its place. Sorry, game object is put there in its place. So they all become game objects disconnected from their original assets. So this is unpacking. Sorry, I have a lot of animations. You have to, I hope you like them. And then we have overrides, which are not a new concept. Do you know what they are? Overrides? Maybe they weren't called like this before. So when you change the property of a prefab in the scene, maybe they had no name, I don't know. Anyway, right now, if I have this rock and I go anywhere in here on its properties, I am able to change them. I can do something like 2, 2, and 2. And you see, as soon as I change the values, they become bold, and I'm creating overrides. So I'm overriding that property. I'm overriding the value of that property inside the box. I'm overriding it outside the box, right? And then we have the familiar workflow that you're used to, which is based on overrides, the one that allows for apply and revert. Right? So apply and revert are not gone. They're there. As I said, we want to discourage using them as a routine because they create a lot of damage sometimes. You make a change and you hit apply and you're like, no, I didn't want to apply, and you just broke the prefab for everyone because apply is not undoable. So my suggestion is to go into prefab mode, open the box, make the changes inside, close the box, and you're safe. But overrides are there, and you get a lot of visibility with this new thing called the overrides dropdown. So the override dropdown, as you can see, appears on a prefab, on any prefab, and it shows you that the overrides are on the rock game object, well, rock prefab, on its transform, and then it shows you the property that's the culprit. And the cool thing now is that not only I see this thing, which is called the comparison view, so I'm able to compare the two values and, you know, make a decision whether that was a mistake or that was intentional, or ask somebody and say, like, why did you leave this thing here if it was this thing before, right? The other thing that I can do in this new workflow is apply and revert on a much finer level. So now I have revert all, apply all, which will basically apply all of the changes. I'm going to show you by making any other change here. I'm going to just destroy this prefab, right? And then you see them appearing here as nice overrides. You can even remove a component. The component doesn't go away, but it leaves a trace behind as an override, and it shows you that there was something there before. So then you can go in here, and you can say, I want this component back. And so you can revert all and apply all. You can revert and apply on the component level, or you can revert and apply on the single property. So you have a lot of control over revert and applying. Let's say I want to revert them all. I just click revert all, and I get everything back, including the component that I had just deleted. In this context, I like to think of overrides as stickers that you just like stick on top of the box. So you have the game object inside, you wrap it, and then on top of the box you put a sticker that has a new value. That covers the old value, right? The old value, though, and I'll show you now, 4, 4, and 4, override. If I go inside prefab mode, the rock is still 1, 6. So the old value is still inside. The sticker is only on the outside, right? On the outside of the box. So full control, full visibility, less mistakes. And in this context, I wanted to visualize the two operations. Revert works just as like removing the sticker, while apply is a bit more complicated and works like this. You take the new value, you bring it in, you merge it, so you change the value inside the box, and then, you know, because prefabs work like that, you're going to see the new value outside. But it's not an override anymore, and that's apply, right? So you get rid of the sticker, and you change the value. And the interesting thing with apply and revert in this new system is because we can have nested prefabs, then you can apply and revert on multiple levels. So you can send that sticker to different levels inside the box. You can open the box again and again and find the innermost prefab that was nested and put it there. So for instance, if I take this well, which has just one nested prefab, and I make some changes to the rock. Sorry, the boring change is just scaling. This override, if I select the well and I click overrides, I go to the transform, and I hit apply, you see I have two options. I can apply the override as an override in prefab well, which means open this box, find the rock inside, and apply it. Or I can apply it to the prefab rock, which means open this box, find the rock, open the box, find the game object, and apply. Is it clear? Sure? Are you lying? Okay. I know it's complicated. I mean, once you see it in action, it makes a lot of sense, and it's super powerful. So, one important thing to remember about overrides is that there can be overrides on game objects. So if you open a prefab and you change any value on the root, for example, that value is going to be applied instantly, because actually it's going to be saved instantly, right? Because it can't become an override. But if you see a prefab from the outside, from the box level, then you can change value and they become overrides. I don't know what I was showing here. So now I want to show you the variants. I mentioned them very briefly. The concept with the variants is very simple. Let's take this prefab, for example. I have created these overrides, these changes on this particular instance of the prefab rock, which is now pretty broken, but anyway. And I like it. I love it. I love this rock. And I want to save it and reuse it. And I want to save it and reuse it with the overrides, but I don't want to apply the overrides to the inner prefab, sorry, to the inner game object, because I might be destroying somebody else's work. They placed this rock somewhere else with those sizes. So now what I can do is I can take this prefab, go to the prefabs folder where I was saving my stuff before, if I can find it, drag the rock, and now Unity gives me two new options. Well, one new option. It says you can save this object as an original prefab, so perfect copy, same values, but they're not overrides, and you lose the connection with the original one. Or you can use it. You can save it as a variant. If I save it as a variant, this rock becomes a prefab variant, and also the prefab variant is swapped here into the hierarchy automatically, as you would expect, right? When you create a prefab, that thing becomes a prefab. So I've wrapped the prefab into another box, a special box, which is the variant. And this allows me to do a couple of things. The variant allows me, for example, to keep making changes to my rock as overrides, but then somebody can take the original rock prefab, maybe change the mesh, and I will receive the mesh into my prefab. So variants, you can see them as inheritance. You can see them in many ways. But at the end of the day, yeah, they are basically variants. They're basically wrappers for overrides that you want to make on the root object. So this is a prefab with an override. Same as before, you wrap it inside a new container. And the value is still visible outside, but not as an override. So the variants are just the wrappers for prefabs, basically. The difference between a prefab and a variant, what's the difference? It's the root, right? So the root object of a variant is a prefab. A root object of a prefab or of a regular prefab is a game object. You can't go wrong with this. I mean, there's also the icon, but. So they serve two similar but slightly different functions. Another cool use of variants is this one. Let's say I have these vegetables. I have these two boxes of vegetables, very nice. They look exactly the same. One is a bunch of prefabs. They're called crate. The other one is a bunch of variants. They're called GMO crate. All the variants, they inherit from this bitroot, which is the archetype. So the bitroot is just a regular prefab, as you can see here. I took it, I wrapped it into a variant, and then I opened it again, and I changed the mesh and the material. So if I open any of these GMO variants, for example, the leek, and I go inside, basically this, even if it's called leek, is a representation of the bitroot. But as you can see, I've overridden the mesh, the material, and the mesh used for the collision, right? So it's exactly like the bitroot. It has the same components, it has the same sizing, even though it's overridden for some reason, but it's 1, 1, 1. Same secondary material, but just the first material, I changed it, and that makes it a leek. And this means that basically now, for all of these variant vegetables, I have one central control point where I can go inside and say I want to disable the collider on all of them. I can go inside, I do this. Well, it was already disabled. I want to enable it. I enable it, and now all of the variants are enabled. Well, if I go to the original ones, which are just regular prefabs, I will need to go inside and say, go in here and enable, go in here and enable, because they're all independent. So variants are very useful for these situations where you have something that repeats in some variation, but all the variations have some kind of common rules. They have some common, not common, but like exactly the same components and maybe structure. Although you can also add things to variants. Like I could potentially, this is the rock, I could totally, where are the rocks? This is the rock variant. I could totally go in here and add another rock, which is huge. And make it like a little cluster. So now this variant has, as you can see, a root, which is the base prefab, and then it has an added object as an override, and that's shown by the little plus. Don't forget that you don't want to apply when you're in variants. This was something that it took me a while to understand. I thought, why do I want to leave overrides behind? Like, overrides are dirty. I was like, have I come all the way to 2018.3 to see overrides again? Like, what is this? So I was applying the overrides, but the reality is you want to keep them, because the overrides, give you the ability also to remove that value. So then you can retransform this variant into something more similar to its base. Anyway, you don't want to apply, because otherwise you're touching the prefab that's implemented in here. And then finally, when you if you want to to make this change and think of prefabs as boxes, actually the scene is the biggest box, because the scene is this thing that can contain game objects, that can contain prefabs, variants, and prefabs that can have overrides. And the only thing that the scene doesn't have is the root, the concept of the root, right? There's no concept of one object that is like the main one, which is instead central to the prefab workflow. And I want to show you this. When you open the override dropdown, I don't know if you noticed, the override dropdown shows you the context. So it basically shows you into which box are you. These overrides that I made before to the rock variant are on the rock variant, living in the scene, right? So they have been stuck on top of this box, which has been placed in the scene. If you go inside the rock variant and you select this one, then you see that the overrides to the original prefab are living in the variant, right? So the overrides dropdown not only shows you a very clear overview, but it shows you the context, because you want to know where you're applying those things, where you're taking them from and where you are applying them to. And so, are you still with me? Maybe I needed some music. So now you understand a bit better about the new prefab workflow, the prefab mode. I talked about the prefab mode, which is, of course, this safer environment where you can step into and make your edits. I talked about the overrides dropdown and all the control that it gives you over the overrides, whether you want to apply them, revert them, at the component level, at the property level, and where do you want to send them, right? And I talked about variants, which are wrapper for prefabs. There's one last case that maybe I can show you, because we still have like 16 minutes. I'm going to be very brief. There's a special type of prefab that Unity always had, which is called prefab model. Who knew about prefab models? One person? Two person? Wow. So prefab models are this thing. Prefab models are basically a mesh. They're an FBX, an OBJ, a blend file. They come into Unity. Unity, churns them, imports them, and transforms them into something that looks like a prefab. It's kind of like a little object with a root and some other object around. And it gives it this particular icon that you must have seen somewhere, right? The little blue cube with a page. That's a prefab model. So the idea with prefab models is, before, you would just do this. You would just go like, I like this 3D model. I'll bring it into here, and I'll start working on it. So I'm just starting to set up my components. I'm going to set up some colliders. I'm going to set up some hinges here, because I want to make it physically based. And then I take it, I bring it into the prefabs. It becomes a prefabs, and it kind of breaks that link with the prefab model, which means that when you go back to your 3D modeling package, you make some changes. And I don't talk about changes about the mesh, because changes to the mesh are always passed through. If you move a vertex, mesh is going to be updated. That was happening before, and it will always happen. Do you know why? Because the mesh is an asset. So the object in the scene is referencing an asset at the end of the day, right? The mesh. So as you change the mesh, it's going to change. But the prefab is not. The prefab is also an asset, but the instance in the scene is not. So what you wouldn't see is, for example, you change the position of the objects or you reparent some objects. You go back to Unity, and your prefab doesn't reflect any change. And you have to throw away that prefab, bring the mesh, the prefab model, into the hierarchy, reapply all the components, set up all the particle system, all the colliders, and remake it into a prefab. And then as you do that, your friend says, like, oh, I have a new version. And you're like, fuck. So now the prefab workflow allows you to do this, allows you to take that prefab model and wrap it into a variant. Exactly like you would do with a normal prefab. Unity treats prefab models like prefabs, so it's able to wrap them into a variant, and then you apply all of your component and stuff as overrides. Very linear. So it means that, I will take this gate and, for example, expand the hierarchy and select this door, which is obviously a game object, and add, for example, a box collider, right? Set up all my components. You see the box collider immediately appears as an override because the the prefab model doesn't have it, right? So it's an override. And then I make it into a, let me find the folder. I make it into a variant. And now I have my gate, and it has the collider, and I can step inside, and I see the collider here on door left as an override, but from the outside, I just see it as a regular object, as I would expect, right? As a regular component. So I've taken the prefab model, made some changes, which are like my labels, applied all these labels, and then I wrapped it into a variant, right? And that's my ready-to-use prefab. In fact, I would say it's almost a good practice to make every single model into a variant. Because why not? Like, why would you ever not do it? You wouldn't do it only if you think that you will never, ever, ever change that mesh again. But even then, just make a variant. So we're thinking of maybe making it automatic or offering the option to make it automatic and stuff like that. So for instance, you see here I have this gate. This is my actually setup gate that I set up before. I set up with nice colliders when I need them. This has a collider, but also has a rigid body because I wanted it to swing. I set up a hinge joint. I left some overrides here, which I shouldn't have done. And that allows me to do something like this. I have this little animation where the car enters and it opens the doors and they nicely react physically. But maybe they're too narrow, so I want to go into the model and change it. And because I want to do a clean job, I want to make it from my modeling package. So I open the variant, I find the asset that I want to change, double click. It's going to open model, which of course I haven't opened, but it's going to be very quick. It always creates a camera and a directional light for some reason. And then in here, I can do something like this. I can move the pole a little bit. I can move the other pole. I can move the door. Sorry, I should have done it together. Door left. And then I can do, of course, a vertices modification. That's totally fine, like before. So we'll do something like this, and I extend the vertices. And again, this was something that you already had in Unity. Like, you change the vertices of a mesh, the polygons, they port into any instance that's using that mesh. I haven't saved yet. I'll just show you how. This is my gate, right? And I want to use the same prefab. This is the prefab model. In the old workflow, you would just make this into a regular prefab, right? This is the old workflow. And now if I go back to model and I save, I go back to Unity, and this one updates. and the other one doesn't. Because the other one has been disconnected from its prefab model, right? If I open this prefab, in fact, I find a game object. I don't find a model. So this has been like collapsed into a game object, and now it's nothing else but a reference to the different meshes. And it has no components and nothing that I have set up before. So you see the power of this workflow again, of turning any prefab model into a variant. And I think this is it. I don't want to keep you any longer, unless you have some question. We have like 5 minutes. I have to be very briefly worded. Yeah. You want to go to the mic?
So with the prefab variants, if you were to make a change in the base prefab, that will affect everything in the variant that is not an override? Is that how it works? Or is there a way you can say, don't affect this part of the variant? Or do you have to make an override in the variant for it not to be pushed down?
So you imagine you have a variant that encapsulates a prefab. If you make changes to this, only the changes you make are going to be sent to the variant.
Right.
But if they're overridden in here, then it doesn't receive them.
Right, okay, so if you make a change to the base prefab that you didn't want to push to variants, like say you've set it all up and you've got a bunch of variants off a certain prefab, but then you want to change the base prefab but not have those changes pushed to the variant, is there a way to do that? Or you have to go in and then manually create overrides on the variant?
No, you would have to create overrides.
Okay.
Either create overrides, or you could do another thing. You could go into the variant and unpack the prefab at the bottom, but you break the link. While if you create overrides, you create like a stopper just for that specific property or component, and that might do the job for what you're saying.
Okay.
One thing to remember is that you can't remove things from variants. So for example, this is a variant, and it's implementing a prefab. I can't remove the component. Oh, sorry, I can remove it as an override. But for example, I need a more complex one. Let me go into the rock. Assume I just make the rock more complex and go into the variant, and now there's like all the complexity of the rock inside. I can't, for example, reorder these ones. So reordering, or for example, deleting a child that comes from the original prefab is not doable, because then down the chain it would be impossible for Unity to recognize like where that change went, and you maybe apply an override up the chain, but the object is not there anymore. So they decided to stop this possibility. Other questions?
Can you change the default lighting inside of the preview?
You can use the button here, and then what you can do is you have an option to go into settings. They're here somewhere. Editor, and assign what is called a prefab editing environment.
Okay.
So you create a scene that when you edit a prefab, so you go into prefab mode, right? You open the box, you see the prefab in isolation, but in a scene.
Right.
And what you see is the prefab in the center, the objects, wherever you place them, but grayed out, impossible to be selected, and not in the hierarchy.
That's cool.
So you still just see and you can create lights, and then you have custom lighting.
Yeah. Thanks.
No worries. And you can create one for the UI, one specific one for the UI.
Hi. First of all, this looks really, really great. I can't wait to try it. Just a quick question. Is there any work planned to support Unity having a prefab where the underlying asset, such as the raw mesh from from Blender or Modo or whatever, or a texture, not at the Unity game object level, but the underlying asset files themselves could be an external link to something somewhere else in the environment? So for example, if you have 4 projects that use the same library of substance things or textures, things like that, that you wouldn't have to have that replicated on your disk, and then it would just be pulled in as a physical copy when you actually do a build. Is there anything planned for that, do you know of?
I'm not sure. Never heard of this requirement. We do something similar now with packages, where you have these bits of code that are somewhere in your machine, and actually it's code, but also images. So you see here packages, how Unity is going to deliver features from now on. They are not actually in my project. They're somewhere in a cache, and then as I load the project, Unity loads them, but they're not in the project. When it builds, then it will put them in. You could do something similar maybe, because you can create your own packages. So you could potentially have just a package that you make yourself, and you store it on a server, and then you distribute it to your team, and they use it and reuse it in multiple Unity projects.
Okay, thanks.
And then the prefabs could use them, yeah. No more questions? Cool. Thank you so much.